Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Keim, curator at Stenton, the circa 1730 seat of the Logan family near Germantown, administered as a historic house museum by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania since 1899. Thank you for joining us today for the first in our two-part video series, plus a tour in the Books Are My Disease programs, a collaboration between Stenton and the Library Company of Philadelphia. I first met Jim Green, whose video you don't quite yet see, in 1999 when he came to Stenton to see something you'll see in our video presentation, the original bookcase, as we call it at Stenton, which is in the blue lodging room. Jim and I collaborated again in 2002 when he agreed to lend some of James Logan's books to the loan exhibition at the Philadelphia Antique Show to place on this bookcase, which we learned is actually a very rickety thing unless it's actually sitting on the chair rail in the room, as you'll see in the video presentation. At Stenton, we're fond of saying that James Logan's brain lives at the Library Company. We always enjoy partnerships and collaborations with other institutions and Logan descendants that support our pursuit to represent and tell as full a history as possible of both the Logan family and life at Stenton. We're grateful for enriching connection with the Library Company that expands the stories and resulting programs that we can create together. Today, in this first of the series, we will consider in this video just where the books of the Loganian Library were housed at Stenton. And so please stay tuned for the video conversation between me and Jim Green, which we pre-recorded in the spring, and then our live Q&A. And we look forward to bringing your questions and having a lively discussion. Jim Green is Librarian Emeritus of the Library Company of Philadelphia, having retired in May of 2021 after 38 years of service. He served on the editorial board of the multi-volume collaborative History of the Book in America, published by the American Antiquarian Society from 2000 to 2010, and his 3 long essays on printing and book publishing from 1680 to 1840 appear in its first 2 volumes. Jim is also co-author with Peter Stollybras of Benjamin Franklin, writer and printer from Oak Knoll Press and the British Librarian. That was in 2006. And he teaches courses on the history of the book in America at the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia and at the University of Pennsylvania. And we are also joined today by Emily Guthrie, who is recently joined the staff of the Library Company as librarian in April of 2021, where she oversees and supports the work of all the staff, catalogers, conservators, curators, research fellowship managers, and reference librarians at the Library Company. And Emily has spent a large part of her library career at Winterthur Museum, which she had joined the library there in 2005, and was the NEH librarian for the printed book collection, becoming director of that library in 2017. So I got to know Emily a little bit while she was at Winterthur, and I'm just so delighted that she is up in Philadelphia and here at the Library Company, where we will actually be doing the second in this series in situ with the books at the Library Company next Tuesday. So I do hope you'll join us again, and we can get started with the video portion of our presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Keim, Stenton's curator, and I'm joined today for this program, Books Are My Disease, with Jim Green, who's the Emeritus Curator, Emeritus Librarian from the Library Company of Philadelphia, where he worked with the book collections there for 3+ decades, 3.8 decades to be exact. And Jim has thought a lot about the Loganian Library, the Logan book collections that are there, many times over the years, and we first met, in fact, I think around 20 years ago, upstairs together, looking at this sort of what we call the original bookcase to survive in the house, and has participated in events we've had and conferences presenting about Logan and the books. And we've invited Jim back today for this special occasion because yet again, we continue to think more about the progression of when the books specific, how they were accumulated at what points in time, and what that actually means for where they were stored at Stenton as the library grew and what Logan's intentions were behind that. And since we're thinking about the house and this question of where were the books, I wanted to just point out to you this Logan probate inventory. This is actually photographs, or I'm not even sure exactly what photographic process they are, and I think it may date to the mid-20th century. Logan's probate inventory is actually missing from the city archives, so this is one of a number of copies of it that survive. And it lists the things at Stenton room by room, which is just so wonderful for us for interpreting the house and what was in it, that we know the back dining room, the lodging room being the first floor lodging room, the parlor, the hall and entry where we're standing. And there's a room missing from this, if you follow it all along. And it's been interpreted as a gentleman merchant's office here at Stenton since the 1960s, in part based on research done by a Winterthur student then, Ray Shepard. But Jim and I are going to talk today about the possibility, the very real possibility, that it may have even been the primary location of the library itself. And as part of this probate inventory, I'll just mention that Richard Peters and Benjamin Franklin were the ones to sign off on the assessment of the books themselves as far as their evaluation. And it says that they have perused the catalog of the late Mr. James Logan's library, wrote with his own hand, together with the invoices of books purchased since those catalogs, and it's plural, catalogs were made, and having also viewed the books, do appraise and value the same at 900 pounds current money of Pennsylvania. Witness our hands at Stenton this 31st day of July, 1752. So Richard Peters and Benjamin Franklin making this assessment of the value of the library at the time of Logan's death. And Logan did not leave the books to the Library Company of Philadelphia, where they are today. He set it up, and Jim can explain this even more, so that there would be his own library building and trust. And we do have a letter here that's dated June 18th of 1745. One of the members of the Library Company, Joseph Brightnall, who was also a poet, writing to Logan, actually asking him to consider leaving the books to the Library Company, basically saying how well cared for they would be, that they would be on shelves, they would have his name in all of them, probably a book plate, there would be golden gilded lettering on the spine, so kind of appealing to Logan's ego that it would be really great to leave this monument at the Library Company, which Logan did not do. So I don't know if you want to say.
Well, yeah, I can. What Logan did do was build his own library building and leave the library to the city of Philadelphia. And the building that he built, which is no longer standing, was on 6th Street opposite the office, opposite Washington Square. And the building was, we have a plan of it, a view of it. It was kind of low built. Measurements are 64 wide and 15 feet deep. So it was a kind of long, narrow building. That 64-foot dimension turned out to be very important in my interest in reconstructing how books were shelved here. because and I guess I should say that the Logan's Library is incorporated into the library company and it's scattered all throughout the library in different classification schemes. So it's very hard to say just how much space those books would have taken up. So one of the things I did long ago when Laura and I were first wrestling with this problem was try to figure out how many, if you had a bookshelf that was sort of the normal height width of a bookshelf in a library today, how much space would those books have taken up? And I did very elaborate calculations and arrived at, all by myself, I arrived at that you would need 64 running feet of shelves to hold all the books. And well, of course, that's the width of his library building. So that made me think that I was really onto something here, that the library would have taken up a lot of 64 running feet of shelf space. Well, there is no place in Stenton that has 64 running feet of space.
All this furniture,
And
much of which has to fit in the walls as well.
And and so it's very hard. There's certainly no one room. It's even hard to think of it in several rooms where those 64 feet of running feet of shelving could have gone. So that was the kind of problem that we were wrestling with.
Yeah, and I really wish that Franklin and Peters had actually said, and in the library,
yes,
but they did not.
They did not. So we don't know where, but I think we have a theory now that we're going to talk about in this program. And to do that, I guess we should step across the hall to the office. So we're now standing in the office, as it's sometimes called.
It's the missing room.
It's the missing room, the room that was not present in the inventory. And this is a room that a lot of people thought, and I think too, was probably used at least at some stages in the development of the Loganian Library as the library room. You can see it's not a very big room, and the 64 feet that you would need of running shelf space to hold the library, nowhere near. I think the maximum in this room is maybe 22 running feet of shelf space. And that would involve making it so that door back there, for example, would fully open, and that there would be no room for any of the furniture that's now around the walls. So, but I think about this building, this room, as a place that could have held part of the library, and I have a theory about that, which goes something like this. In 1744, or maybe a few ending in 1744, there was a period when Logan wrote a catalog. Actually, his son-in-law, Isaac Norris, wrote a manuscript catalog started a manuscript catalog of the books in his library. And in this catalog, which is beautifully arranged and looks to me, and is so neatly done, it looks to me like it's a shelf list. It's somebody going around a room and writing down the names of all the titles of all the books in the room. And on that catalog are all the books that Logan was proudest of, and the ones he always told people. I have all the church fathers. I have all the Greek and Latin classics and so forth. They were all in that catalog, and I think they were probably all together. If they were all together in one room, this could have been that room. And so it's, I mean, it's even conceivable that he could have pressed this closet into service as a book storage room. But what I'm imagining is that all the empty wall space was covered with bookshelves. And probably you see that these are the kind of bookshelves that could have been used in a library at a somewhat later date, in the late 18th century.
Well, and when we go upstairs to look at the shelf, you'll see how you can imagine something that really could have been customized to take even more advantage of the wall than the large furniture from the late 18th century that's there now.
Exactly. So not bookshelves like these, but very different kind, which we'll see in a second.
So we're on the second floor now, above that room that we're postulating was the main library. So there are a number of reasons that make it convenient that this would be the library. One being, as you're looking around the room, you're going to see a door that leads to the service stair, and that made it easy for a servant or somebody else who knew where the books were to grant requests to bring them from upstairs to downstairs. But as you're looking at the sort of panning of this space, which was called the Blue Lodging Room, it's a bedchamber. And in the 18th century, bedchambers were also very public spaces where textiles were on show in a house. In the case of the Logans, their textiles and their books would have been show-off reasons to come upstairs. You're maybe capturing in the distance our yellow lodging room, which has a flying tester bedstead of old damask style for tequila. That was another kind of high point visiting Stenton. Another little bit that tells us books were here in the past is, as the room is furnished now, it has many possessions that belong to Dr. George Logan and Deborah Norris Logan, his wife, who lived here beginning in the 1780s. They're the third generation. Isaac Norris II, who made the book catalogs that Jim's going to talk about, would have been her uncle. And so she used this space as her bedchamber. And she left a lot of diaries that are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and a volume also at the Library Company. And in her diaries, she says that her room is the one on the second floor with 4 windows, which could only be this room because there's actually a window behind that bedstead. And she calls her room my apartment in the library. And the books left the house when James Logan died. But it may be that she's also thinking about this space as having been a library in the past, a kind of recollection of the library. And the physical evidence for this is very much wrapped up with this bookcase here that Jim is going to talk about. It was found up in the attic at Stenton, where it had been basically for 200 years, and was brought down and tried in various locations of the house and determined that it fits right here.
Yeah, so this is the real proof that books were in this room, and a lot of books. But I want to talk a little bit about, and you can also see what Laura means about how it was fit in here. I don't know if you can. There are actually notches cut in the bookcase to make way for the chair rail.
And the baseboard as well.
And the baseboard, yeah. And there also were sort of shadow marks on the wall where this shelf was, and also, incidentally, other marks that I guess we can't see now, but were earlier visible, of shelving going across the top of the door. But this is the shelf that actually survives. And the thing that's so striking about it is that it's totally unlike the furniture, full furniture built bookcases that you saw a minute ago downstairs. This is very roughly carpentered by comparison. And bookshelves like this, which seem to us to be kind of like normal bookshelves, were actually very unusual at this time. Most books were kept in chests or in furniture like we were looking at a minute ago. And shelves like these, which were meant to hold lots of books in a very simple fashion. Most people didn't have very many books. People didn't need bookshelves like this. I think these are probably the earliest bookshelves of this open kind that have survived. This, I mean, is the earliest to survive. Also, it's made very simply as a piece of carpentry. And I've been walking around the house today and looking. I'm fascinated by this bead. You call it a bead molding?
Rounded beaded edge to this shelf and all the other places it appears.
It's all over the house. The molding all over the house is like this. So I think this was built probably using the same kinds of tools by a carpenter, not a furniture maker, and maybe even at a time not so long after the house itself was built. Certainly in Logan's lifetime anyway. So the other thing about this that makes it a bookshelf is, and this is part of this reconstruction that I did mentally of the library, is that Logan's books came in 4 sizes, and his catalog actually notes the 4 sizes for every single volume, and notes them as grouped together by size. And the folios are the tallest books, and they were on the bottom shelves. And quartos are the next largest, and those were on this shelf, the navy part of this shelf. And then above the top 2 shelves, the smaller formats, octavo and duodecimo.
And this refers to the sizes of the papers, because the folio is a single sheet. And then as you would fold and cut them, they would get proportionally smaller.
Right, but yeah, so I mean, it was very obvious to people in those days what size a book was, because they really did come in just 4 sizes. And this shelf, that makes this shelf a bookshelf and not some other kind of shelving. And then the other thing, so this when Laura showed me the shelf, it was like a real aha moment that that you really could. This is what allowed me to think about how to figure out how many running shelf feet Logan's library would have taken, because I was imagining it would all be on, or mostly be on shelves like this. But there's another thing too that Laura showed me, which is it's so amazing, that next to this shelf, a closet that you saying was built with the house has the same kind of gradation of shelves at about, I don't know if you can catch the similarity between the height and the spacing of the shelves between the closet and the bookcase.
Particularly if you imagine a platform of some sort in the bottom of the closet.
Can you show the 2 of them sort of pan from one to the other? So Logan was probably thinking, even as he designed the house, that this would be a way to store his books. And maybe at that time he didn't have very many books. I think by the time that catalog I mentioned a minute ago was compiled, he had a lot more books and was starting to wonder where he could fit them all in. But by the time he died, he had many, many more books. And that's another story. But this, I'm imagining that as the library grew, that bookshelves like this have built not only in the office, but all around the house, wherever they would fit.
And this too, with shelving, that could also have accommodated some books.
This is more like books were shelved traditionally for some of the Logan's generation in houses in Europe as well as America, because books were precious and you wanted to have them locked away,
clean,
and out of the way. This way of displaying them on open shelves, which were not at all secure, and you know, if you didn't like that, were not a very conventional way of displaying books, but something that Logan had to do in order to accommodate what was, I think, even at that point, probably the largest private library. One of the most important features of this bookcase that shows that it was made to fit in this space is this curving end to it, which just barely clears the door. And also, I think, explains why this bookcase stayed in the house, because when those 64 feet of running shelf feet of books were moved to the library the new library on 6th Street in 1751, I'm guessing that all of the shelves in the house went with it and were used, except this one, which with this funny curve wouldn't really left behind.
So people always want to know, are there any ghosts at Stenton? And there are architectural ghosts. And this is one of them, which we only actually really discovered several years ago. There used to be a big loom up here and a bunch of spinning wheels. This was a kind of, we used to call this room the room where spinning wheels went to die, kind of a colonial revival storage room. And we moved our looming problem out so that we could interpret the fact that this middle garret or middle room was a space we'd come to believe probably enslaved people slept in at Stenton, certainly in the first generation. In the process of moving the loom, we saw the ghost of the bookcase downstairs that Jim just talked about emerge on the wall. And it had said in our HSR, Historic Structures Report, that that bookcase had been found in the attic, but I never knew exactly where. So it's very exciting to find that it's being here for a couple hundred years, left the ghost both in the floor and up the wall. And we may not have mentioned it downstairs, but an identical hook sits right in the side of the bookcase at the height of this shelf to these three hooks here. And you can imagine workers potentially, or others going in and out of this space and being able to maybe hang hats or clothing. And this communicates directly to the servants' side of the attic here at Stenton, which is all unpainted. Like the boards combination of pine, just like the bookcase itself, with oak framing that makes the attic walls. And if you'd like to say something about your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, obviously the what you call it, the irony of the most valuable books in colonial America sitting on the same shelves that were later used in an attic room where enslaved workers lived. It kind of takes your breath away. But there's also another thing about this room that appeals to me and makes me think that the story might be a little bit more complicated. And that is this graffiti, I guess that's the word for it, on the door. Can you read it out?
Yes, it says William Logan Jr. sailed for England October 7th, 1760, and we can't quite make out the final digit, and maybe we could with some research find out exactly when he went. But he's the son of William Logan, son of James, so he's James Logan's grandson, and headed to England to pursue a degree and schooling.
And he went to medical school, and though he didn't live long enough to have a full medical practice, he left a lot of books. And so another possibility is that the bookcase came up here after Logan. So Logan died in 1751. His books were moved to the new Loganian Library around 1760, in the late 1750s anyway. And the idea that then the bookshelf was moved up here and that William Logan might have kept his books here is also a possible scenario.
So on that James Logan probate inventory, this room was just listed as the lodging room, and we have called it the first floor lodging room mentally, just to distinguish that. And it seems pretty clear that when Stenton was being built, we talked about the built-in book press upstairs, and one of the other features of the house is that the bed chambers on the second floor all had hooks in the ceiling, which had to do with supporting the tester frames or curtains for the bedsteads. This first floor lodging room doesn't have those hooks, and it seems that it maybe wasn't intended as a bed chamber and probably more of a back parlor. Before the Logans finished the house and were able to move into it in 1730, James Logan fell on the ice and broke his hip in the socket. And there's a correspondence with his brother, Dr. William Logan, about what he went through. But it maybe brought on a kind of redesign of the house with a first floor bedchamber for someone who was going to be movement impaired for the remainder of the time he would live. So his 20 some years in here were in that state of not being able to walk and get himself around. And he was sometimes carried upstairs, but probably his life focused on the ground floor, also boosting Jim's theories about it makes a lot of sense that he would ultimately put the bulk of the books on the first floor.
Or that he would find it very convenient to be sleeping where the best books were. The books that were scattered over the house may not have been the ones he loved the most. And that's my theory, is that the ones that were in the office, which is just across the hall here, were the ones that he wanted to be near.
And isn't it that these invoices that are referenced on that probate inventory are sort of like big bulk purchases toward the end of Logan's life, as he's really trying to grow the library, and Jim thinks it's possible he may not have even been able to read and comb through those the way he was known to do. And really, his library is extensively annotated. And maybe it's fair to say the books he purchased earlier on, he was even more selective because he wasn't able to purchase bulk as many books at one time.
Yes. Really, I think what happened was that he decided in around 1742 or so that he was, for example, not going to give his books to the library company, or he wasn't, more importantly, wasn't going to will them to any of his relatives, but that he would give them to the city. And once he decided he was building a public library, he realized that there were a lot of books that he didn't particularly need, but that other people would appreciate having. So I think really you can think of the library as three pieces. The books in the 1744 catalog, which were the most important ones, the ones he got the first, the ones he studied the hardest, annotated the most. And the second part is there was the state inventory mentions catalogs, plural. So there's probably another catalog made of all the other books he got, probably over the course of the 1740s, that were not, in his mind, the heart of the library, but were the one for him, but were the ones that he thought would be useful for the citizens of Philadelphia, who, by the way, did not use the library once he gave it to them, because they could only read English, most of them, fortunately. So, and then the third part are the ones that are referred to in the postmortem inventory as evaluated based on invoices. And that suggests to me that this part of the library was received very late. And we know that he ordered huge quantities of books in the last year or two of his life. Probably were never put on shelves or cataloged, maybe not even unpacked. And that's...
The invoices were in effect the catalog.
Were the catalog, yeah, exactly. So, so you have to imagine that maybe a third of the library was in the office. Maybe another third was in shelves in the Blue Lodging room or in his room, maybe. And then another third or so, or maybe last quarter, were probably never even unpacked.
So other things in this room that speak to Logan's injury and state are the easy chair that we have here, which is on loan from the Dietrich Foundation and looks quite a lot like the Logan surviving one that's in a private collection today. On that probate inventory, though, that chair, that easy chair, is in the parlor, which is pretty unusual. They tended to be bedchamber furniture for people who were invalids or quite elderly. That sense of upholstery and comfort. So you can kind of imagine Logan spending time late in life reading in that chair. And we have another little theory to add to our "where were the books," which is that the closet in this room really may be outfitted as a book closet. So this could be stacked with, the reading that you have, those 10 books that are sitting next to your bed that you're reading all at the same time. His very active reading could be stored in here. And again, just reflect, as Jim pointed out with the shelving upstairs, different sizes, a couple of folio shelves and some quartos and maybe octavos up top. We also would love at some point to do more paint analysis, finish analysis, and develop another chronology of color that may relate to finishing inside some of the closets, and whether that helps us to know whether some of the shelves were added at later points in time. But we have a combination in here of shelves with these rounded beaded edges like we see in the old shelving, and some flatter edges that could be possibly added in. And again, at what date would be hard to say.
Or I also just realized I can step in here. these are folios lying on their sides. That's a quarto. So that's the sizes of the books we're talking about. You can sort of imagine.
Yeah.
So looking in this closet reminds me of Logan's comment, which we saw in the entryway earlier. Books are my disease, said Logan. Books are my disease. And I think looking around here, we can see that Stenton was riddled with them.
Thank you, Allison at the Library Company for running the video for us. I just want to say at the outset that this is the first time that we had done a recording with two people. And I think that I learned a couple things. One is that each person really should have a microphone, and that one should wear very quiet shoes when doing this kind of recording. But I hope that you were all able to, capture the conversation between me and Jim about the books and where they were housed. So I don't know if my co-panelists would like to turn their videos on. I was thinking about one, as we get started too, there is a quote that I know really from its published form, which is in this book, this Albert Cook Myers 1904 book, Hannah Logan's Courtship, which is a great diary that includes lots of his visitation to Stenton in the 1740s. John Smith's diary when he was courting James Logan's daughter, Hannah. But this is actually a quote from a visitor to Stenton, William Black of Virginia, who came in 1744. And Jim, it's interesting, this is the same year that you mentioned the Isaac Norris catalog was written. And William Black, after he goes on about how beautiful Hannah was and how he almost burned his lips on the tea because she was so lovely, he says, after the tea table was removed, we were going to take leave, but it appeared we must first view his library, which was customary with him. He had really a very fine collection of books, both ancient and modern. He seemed to regret that none of his sons knew not how to use them, and that he designed them as a legacy to the city when he died. After the old gentleman had been complimented on his fine taste, we departed. And I wanted to bring this quote in just because it says something about the books themselves, but also about how visiting the library and complimenting James Logan on his fine taste in books was almost a requirement for the visit. And there's no mention, so this is more of an absence of evidence, but there's no mention that they went upstairs to do this. And I think perhaps that too reinforces Jim's postulation that the bulk of the library, this primary part of the collection, was indeed on the ground floor, because they most likely would have taken tea in the best parlor on the ground floor as well. So we do have a number of questions that have come in, and Jim, this first one might be a good one for you. How did Thomas Jefferson store his books at Monticello as compared to Logan's method? Also, where did Logan buy his books?
Jefferson's library was shelved in much the same way as Logan's, with the same division between folios on the closer to the ground, closer to the floor, and the smaller formats arranged above. But I have to admit, I have never, not since I got interested in this anyway, in this question of bookshelves, gone to see the bookshelves at Monticello and try to make some sort of judgment about whether they were made as furniture or made by a carpenter. Maybe there's probably somebody on this call who knows Monticello very well indeed, and could tell me whether these were bookshelves that were comparable to Logan's. But in any case, it would have been at a later period, of course, 40 years or more after Logan's death.
And also, how many books did Logan have at his death in 1751?
Well, I have here a somewhat worn out copy of Edwin Wolfe's catalog of Logan's library, and each entry has a number. And
I have two.
Oh, you do? Okay, this is in better shape. And the last number is 2,184. And those are, whenever you're counting books, and especially in this 18th century period, 17th and 18th century period, you have to specify, are you talking about titles, or are you talking about volumes? And so the number of titles is 2,184. And many of Logan's books were in multi-volume sets. And so we figured probably the whole collection would have been, maybe even as much as 4,000 volumes.
And then was Logan entirely eclectic in assembling his library, or did he have particular enthusiasms? If the latter, what were they?
I didn't answer the second part of that first question, though, so hold that. You may have to ask me that one again.
Okay.
Where did Logan get his books? He was very good at sort of separating people from their books in Pennsylvania and in New York, to a lesser extent. Whenever he heard somebody that had a book that he wanted, he would borrow it and maybe even keep it. But that's only a very small part of the library. Most of the books that he wanted were not anywhere in this hemisphere, and he was getting them almost exclusively from booksellers in London. And there were 4 or 5 that he patronized regularly. And in this catalog of the Loganian Library, Edwin Wolfe has transcribed from the Logan papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, transcribed these long letters he wrote to his booksellers. And the fun of this catalog is actually in reading the letters to the booksellers, not in reading the titles of the books, because he was such a crotchety customer and really wanted people to know. Once he said to one bookseller that he was not a mere bearskin merchant, which of course he was a bearskin merchant, because he traded in furs that Native Americans brought to him and traded. But he was also, a real bookman, as to use a word that Edwin Wolfe was very fond of. And so he wanted to make sure that booksellers in London knew about this, and constantly reminded them of how knowledgeable he was.
Yes, in fact, Stenton owns one single letter that was a gift from a descendant, and it had gone to auction at one point, and I think the bookseller maybe was Josiah Martin. And the title of the letter when it was in the auction catalog is "Logan Berates a Bookseller."
Yeah, I know what these books should cost, and you're charging me too much money. That was one of his most common complaints.
Yeah, the second part of that question was about Logan's particular interests and enthusiasms.
Logan's interests and enthusiasms were actually those of the most learned men not only in England but also on the continent in his youth. Actually, I mean, in the late 17th, before he came to North America, and in the 18th centuries. But there was a certain kind of scholar whose erudition was elevated the person to a status, a certain status of almost like the humanists of the Renaissance. But these were this was a little bit later. These were scholars who were interested in philology, that is the study of languages. They were interested in church history, because there's a lot of Latin literature that the church historians generated, writings that were transmitted by manuscript during the Middle Ages, and then finally edited and printed after the advent of the printing press. And this recovery of what was the manuscript culture of antiquity in the Middle Ages was something that Logan was very interested in, and that's all part of this philology that he studied. He was also very interested in mathematics and astronomy, and secondarily modern literature, but there's really not that much in the library. And as Laura was saying on the video, that a lot of those really modern books might have been books that he got late in life because he thought they should be in the Bibliotheca Loganiana, which is what he called it, this public library that he was envisioning. But books that he himself either didn't need to own or had maybe not kept through the course of his life. But the heart of it was ancient languages, literature, and their medieval transmission to modern times.
And I'll just, there's a comment here from Carrie Detorn, the chief curator at Independence Park. She says, Thomas Jefferson's bookcases were actually upturned packing crates without tops or bottoms. And I know, Jim, you even thought, because some of Logan's books maybe never were unpacked, that there could have been an aspect of packing crates being used in some capacity as bookshelves too.
That's, I'm really glad to know that, Carrie. Thank you. Benjamin Franklin's library is another reconstruction that Edwin Wolfe worked on, and that I've kind of tagged along after him and tried to quantify and and clean up the rough edges. And there's a theory, which I think is a very good one, that when Franklin brought all of his books together in Philadelphia after he returned from Paris, just in the few years before his death, and that he also made bookshelves out of packing cases, the very packing cases he had used to ship his books from Paris back to Philadelphia.
A question about, could you explain why Logan chose to build his own library building and give it to the city rather than directly to the library company? Is it fair to call the Loganian the city's first public library?
Well, how do you define a public library? It was a city library. They also called the library company the city library. And I think the two at the time must have seemed like they were sort of similar, because they weren't private libraries, and yet not all the public was allowed in either. And I think that with the Loganian Library, the problem was the doors were mostly closed, and because one of Logan's the way that Logan envisioned this library working was that it would be his own descendants who would be the librarians. And after a while, none of them showed much interest in doing that. And if there was no librarian, then there was no person to open the doors. The library company was probably a little bit more public in the sense that we think of a public library today, because you could borrow the books. Shareholders could borrow books, and people who weren't shareholders could borrow a book if they left a deposit equal to 3 times the value of the book in the hands of a librarian, which is a very Franklinian arrangement. But the Loganian books didn't circulate to anybody, so far as I know. And I think that to a modern library user, that's a big difference.
Yeah, and in keeping with that question about the Loganian Library, someone says that they research a historic site called the Great Spring Tract in Solebury, which is in Bucks County, that had 100-year leases that directed the rent be paid to the Loganian Library, reevaluated in 1860. And do we know anything about that?
Yeah, that was the Loganian Library came with an endowment, and the endowment was land. And the library was funded, if you can think of it that way, by the proceeds of the land as the rents that were paid by the people who rented, and we were their landlord. I mean, this land passed out of the library company's ownership long ago. Whoever's asking the question probably knows a lot more than I do about that. But and of course, now we have endowments where it's even more important today to have endowments, but they're all in stocks and bonds.
Not land.
Invested, not land, no.
Yeah.
As far as I know, the library company does not have any land that it's that it's collecting rents from.
Then there's a question about the languages that James Logan spoke, and maybe specifically you might want to mention how many different languages are represented in the library itself.
Well, the languages he read, and read as easily as you or I would read English, were Latin, Greek, and to a certain extent also Hebrew. But he had other languages that he could read, and he had he had some polyglot texts where several, like the biblical languages, Aramaic and so forth, were also used and reproduced. So he was very interested in languages and learned at least to spell them out. I think even more difficult languages than the ones I just mentioned. But the one that's really most surprising is, and of course, all the modern languages he read very well. Italian, Spanish, German. But the really surprising one is that he was a pretty good reader and even speaker of Arabic. And this is based on some sort of maybe slightly apocryphal stories, but of course he set out to learn Arabic and to be able to read Arabic using a printed Arabic, a printed transcription of an Arabic translation of Euclid's geometry. And a lot of ancient Greek texts were transmitted into the European Middle Ages by way of Arabic translations. And so we have Logan's Arabic Euclid at the Library Company. And you can see him learning to read Arabic in the text, and even in some places annotating it and writing notes on the flyleaves, and in some places even correcting the Arabic text. So he could read Arabic well enough to know where there had been a typographical error in the Arabic printing that he was working at. And then there's the story it's a lot of fun to think that it might be true, was that at some time in probably the 1830s, an Arabic speaking traveler came to Philadelphia. He was known as Sheikh Sidi. And he was, again, this is just a story, was brought out to Stenton to talk to Logan. So people, it was brought in the I think in the spirit of, okay, let's just see whether this guy can actually do this. And so they put them together, and Logan was able to speak to Sheikh Sidi, and Sheikh Sidi spoke to Logan. And of course, no one understood what the heck they were saying. And I don't know that there was anybody else, at least any white man in North America at this time that could even pretend to speak Arabic. I can't imagine that the conversation with Sheikh Sidi was very deep, because what Logan was looking at was classical Arabic, and probably this traveler might have spoken some much more modern version of it. Anyway, so as a linguist, there was probably nobody that could tick all the boxes that Logan did in speaking and reading and writing all these exotic languages.
Well, and when you consider being mobility impaired too, it was one of his great pastimes, because he wasn't physically mobile. This idea that he could go places in his library.
Right.
There's a question here more directly about Stenton. It says, "I'm sure Stenton is very well built, but would there have been any concern about the weight of too many books concentrated in one place on the second floor? Books are heavy." And we didn't highlight this in the video, but in fact, when you cross the threshold, it's not even a threshold with a sill or anything, but when you go from the best bedchamber, that yellow lodging room where we saw the bedstead off in the distance, and as you actually traverse the floor into the blue lodging room where the books literally hung on the wall on that bookshelf sitting on the chair rail and the baseboard, the floor has a deflection, and you sort of walk uphill as you get into the room, because there was a sinking from those 25 or so years that the books essentially hung there on an unsupported partition wall. So it's a good question, and yes, that increases the physical evidence for books indeed being also on the second floor. Then there's one, and this is a category, but I'll let Jim and maybe Emily speak to this. Does the book collection contain much science? For instance, botany. Logan seems to have had an interest in that, and wasn't Bartram a protege?
Well, I can jump in, and yes, absolutely, he was interested in several sciences that I didn't mention. I mean, I mentioned astronomy, I think, and that was interesting because it was such a deeply mathematical, science. But botany, yes, and he had a very good collection of sort of Linnaean botanical books, one of which he loaned to John Bartram, famously, and got him started on using the Linnaean system and understanding the Linnaean system to classify plants. He had some herbals too. He wasn't collecting the valuable color plate picture books that now seem like the most attractive early modern botanical books, but he was really interested in the books books of classification and with some woodcut pictures.
One here about the linear feet. It's fascinating to hear all the detective work needed to determine the locations of books. Did the 64 linear feet have to be in a straight line, or could the shelves run around the walls? Or were the 64 linear feet measured vertically as well as horizontally?
I was thinking of that only as running feet on the floor. And yes, they could be put anywhere. One of the things that Laura and I have done is going around these rooms in Stenton and measuring, imagining, and I don't think it's foolish to imagine this, that even James Logan wouldn't have built bookshelves of the covered windows. So that you have to look at the space between the windows where there's floor space and against a wall. We also assumed, I think, that he wasn't building shelves that were sticking out from the windows, sticking out from the walls, and that would have made the rest of the room unusable. I mean, I think that any of the bookshelves upstairs would have had to coexist with Laura, all the quantity of furniture that was in those rooms would not have permitted anything except putting books on walls between windows, and also not walls where there were fireplaces or staircase entrances. So yeah, very much they could be. I think they were all put in one line in the building on 6th Street. That's the significance of the 64-foot width of that building, was they would have held 64 running feet of shelves placed side by side. But in the house, no, I think they had to go wherever there was wall space.
And then there are two questions here that we can maybe pair together about the content of the book. And the first one is about, his Quaker principles and performing arts, sort of this idea that, did a Quaker have any performing arts materials as part of his library? And then another one just generally asking about Quaker material. There seems to have been some differences with leading Quaker Assembly members and then it drops off, but just whether there's Quaker material in the library, as well as anything related to kind of fine and performing arts.
Okay, I'm looking to see anything by William Penn in his catalog, and the answer is one book. It's William Penn, The Invalidity of John Faldo's Vindication of his book called Quakerism, No Christianity, being a rejoinder in defense of the answer, entitled Quakerism, a New Nickname for Old Christianity, London, 1673. So, basically nothing. And as far as friends' books, I mean, obviously Logan had he had his library of what I was trying to characterize as erudition of, but sure, he had plenty of Quaker books, but he didn't consider them part of the formal library that he was going to give to the city. And I think he would have felt that everybody, there are other places you could get Quaker books in Philadelphia, and he was building this library to bring the world of learning to Philadelphia, where it couldn't be found anyplace else.
And I think maybe we have time for one more question. And since we've been talking about where the books were, I'll bring in this one from John Pollock. It says, dismantling all of the shelving after James Logan's death and moving everything must have been enormously disruptive and indeed transformative for the house. Is there any testimony about this? I have to. I know I haven't seen any specifically really talking about it, and I think there was a big transition when he died too. His wife, the evidence is strong that his wife moved into a house in town and took a lot of the furnishings with her, and she died only several years later in 1754, and her probate inventory has many of the same objects as were at Stenton. And then when the son William Logan died in 1777, his inventory, he had a townhouse that he built in the 1750s, kind of all new and newly furnished, but he had his parents' objects primarily in situ at Stenton. So there's a tremendous amount of moving around. And I have looked at William Logan's some of his ledgers that document the building of the library. And I was looking at them not too long ago, and I didn't come across any kind of like massive moving fee in what I saw, but it's hard to imagine that there isn't one in there. So I will keep looking, because the other thing I'm trying to see if there's any evidence for, and it's hard to ascertain, is that at Stenton right now, we have on loan a so-called Loganian Library armchair. And this is maybe one of a set of 8 armchairs that were made as a set, which is pretty unusual in and of itself, that some people over the collecting centuries have thought could have come from the Loganian Library. And at least one of them has an association with a descendant in the Smith family having owned it. So we still have some more research to do all the way around on some of those questions. Well, thank you all for tuning in for this with us today. And I hope we'll see all of you again next week from the Library Company. I'll be at the Library Company with Emily with the books, and we will have Jim coming in on Zoom, and we'll be delighted to engage with you again with the actual books. So have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.